Let's start with Bernie Sanders' speech on democratic socialism, which he delivered at George Washington University last week. And I actually did a video on this specifically for the Michael Brooks Show YouTube channel. This was an incredibly important speech, and it was a dialectical one. His speech was class conscious. He juxtaposed an oligarchy versus the people and argued that the working class struggling for economic, racial, gender, and gay liberation would bring us into the future and defeat the sort of prime threats of today, which are unfettered capitalism and the emergent threat of authoritarianism that arises in that capitalist context. He wisely tied his perspective to the FDR tradition. And again, we're seeing this similar dynamic play out a lot in Sanders' campaign. On one hand, there's people that are wanting to pivot to a candidate like Warren that does not have the systemic understanding that Sanders brings to it and is focusing on sort of technocratic, in some cases very positive, but technocratic, non-systemic solutions. And then they're sort of undervaluing Sanders' systems argument and actual diagnosis of the crisis we're in that sets him apart from the other candidates. Then there's the sort of let's play revolutionaries on Twitter that are upset that instead of FDR, Bernie should have been like, foregrounding Fidel Castro in this speech. Okay. The reality is that he is anchoring a profoundly important and unprecedented in modern politics argument for economic rights as the center of politics by wisely linking it to a profoundly important tradition in democratic politics, whether you like it or not. That's the reality. Bernie's commitment to the socialist tradition and socialist movement is central to the reason that he is able to articulate the stakes and the central battle lines of today's politics. Here he is breaking it down with Chris Hayes.
Well, let me ask you this, though. So one of the sort of touchstone points in the speech is about FDR and the New Deal and the Economic Bill of Rights. And again, I would agree with you that his critics called him a socialist, and by today's terms, you'd be called a socialist. But FDR didn't call himself a socialist. The socialists at the time said that he was peddling pale pink pills, that he was basically a sellout capitalist. He probably did that for a reason, right? I mean, that was a political judgment by FDR about his own efficacy. Why does the word matter more than the agenda?
Because it is imperative for people to understand. Look, a lot of people are going to say a lot of good things. But for two reasons, I think the word democratic socialism is relevant. Because if you are serious about, defeating Trump's authoritarianism, which, by the way, is an international phenomenon, you have to do what Roosevelt did and say, you know what, I am taking on the ruling class. And you remember, I mentioned this yesterday, and these people hate me, and I welcome their hatred. In other words, you cannot go forward unless we are prepared to take on incredibly powerful special interests. There is no shortcut around that. And second of all, when I use the word democratic socialism, what I mean is not that, we got to improve the healthcare system. I mean that economic rights are human rights. People are entitled to health care, to education, to a clean environment, to retirement security, to decent housing. This is not just some abstract idea. Freedom of speech is what America is about. I believe that economic rights must also be about what America is about.
So it's not just that Sanders has the right policies, and he absolutely does. And the sort of myth of him not offering specifics is fading on a daily basis as he outlines, as an example, aggressive plans on education, which are formulated in part by teachers. God forbid they be involved in the formulation of major national priorities with regards to education. It's that by understanding the stakes and understanding that the central conflict is about class difference in politics, it's not about some kind of intellectual argument. The reason that Amazon runs our economy, the reason that there's skyrocketing inequality, the reason that people don't have health care, the reason that foreign policy is run the way it is run is not because people haven't thought of clever solutions, and it's not because people are waiting to be persuaded to give up their power, privilege, and access. It's because, in fact, of that raw power disparity. So what Bernie is doing is expanding the playing field and consciousness of people, which is going to be fundamentally necessary to implement even a more modest program than the one he's proposing. The job of the left should be articulating how we are going to use the momentum behind his presidential run and the potential for the presidency to continue this project. I want to talk about Marx's relationship to the French Workers' Party program of 1880. You know, we talk about Marx's critique of the Gotha program as his very perceptive critique of the limits of social democracy if you don't have large monopolies decommodified. But conversely, this is his thoughts on the French Workers' Party program of 1880, and where he famously stated, "I'm not a Marxist." And we'll scroll down. We have this on screen. Let's scroll down to the, if we have it, the economic rights section that Marx had. And I'll read along with it. Basically, Marx advocated a program that included gender pay equity, reductions in the work week, universal education, state aid for elderly and disabled people, among other demands. French party leader Jules Gued, who helped write the program, later pushed for removal, claiming that removing the minimum section would free the proletariat of its last reformist illusions. Marx responded by saying that Gued was not a radical, but a revolutionary phrasemonger, and famously wrote to Engels that if this is Marxism, I'm not a Marxist. In other words, this founder of a pretty radical tradition and a very shrewd understanding of how to look at the world and how to look at capitalism was someone who, in a very pressured context, was able to see that profoundly important advancements in terms of wages, in terms of labor protections, in terms of time, and in terms of an expansion of rights was the foundation upon which new rights were created, new expectations were created, and new demands were asserted. That's what Bernie Sanders is doing in our politics in a completely unprecedented way, in modern politics at least. That's why we need to support his campaign fully and unequivocally, recognize the profound opportunity that it presents if you care about things like every single human being having health care, like the serious response to wealth concentration in this country, and then start taking the next steps to put into play things like nationalizing and decommodifying the natural resources and oil industries. I mean, these are very comparable, obvious places of why on earth should those be privately absorbed from the public commons to be exploited and cause enormous societal damage. We can be innovating ideas of how markets can work in a social context, what needs to be decommodified, and where we can get sort of more visionary in our ideas and demands. But if you don't see that Sanders' campaign is the absolutely unique conduit for that, you either probably don't actually share a systemic understanding of politics, and you don't have the strategic capacity to even implement a reform program, or conversely, you're doing some cosplay bullshit that has nothing to do with what we actually need to achieve for real, actual human beings. And that was the significance of Bernie's speech. I just want to add really briefly with this quote. This is from an excellent piece that ran in Jacobin by Kianga Yamada Taylor. Bernie Sanders' Democratic Socialism speech was a landmark. The white supremacists that head the Republican Party want us all to believe that the biggest problems in this country are not their grotesque policies that steal the wealth of the many and redirect it to the few. Instead, they point the finger at Mexicans, Muslims, and the quote-unquote blacks. Sanders did not resort to flowery homilies that claim that this weaponized racism isn't quote-unquote us, or it is somehow outside of the norms of the American politics or other tribe. Instead, he argued that the wealthy's use of racism to destroy the living standards of otherwise ordinary workers by constantly fraying the mutuality that otherwise bind us together, quoting Dr. King. So that is what is so unprecedented and important about this effort. Do you guys have anything to add before we get to the shout out?
I just really wanted to hit home the point that, being a radical in this moment really is doing the political work where you're saying, here's an opportunity that we have to radically decommodify a lot of the U.S. economy when we're talking about universal health care, when we're talking about Bernie's idea for implementing a worker ownership program. I mean, these are really important moves that we can make. And it's really important, if you look especially at the early history of Marxist and socialist parties, is that this is the double move, right? Where you say, look, here's an opportunity that we have, like the political ability to put this into practice, and we're going to be very clear with our supporters and our members why this helps us get to this next place. And that's why Bernie Sanders is so radically different from Elizabeth Warren, even in that in his democratic socialism speech, because he was able to say, here's what we want to do, and also here are the ideals that are guiding us, and this idea of what we want to be getting to. And having that kind of politics is something that's so important to being a radical and being a socialist, rather though than what some people do, these revolutionary phrase mongers, who aren't actually trying to develop political consciousness in this country. They just want to say like, oh, well, I have a great vision for something, and then there's no way to get there, and it's sort of useless.
Absolutely. Yeah, Matt.
This sort of just reminds me of this Tia Rio Franco's tweet from a few weeks ago. Warren's call for economic patriotism resonates with the xenophobic right. A lot of people were upset that I retweeted this, but Tia goes on to say, that's because it assumes mythic unity between American bosses and workers aligned against foreign competition. But workers and bosses' interests cross borders.
That's exactly right. And I'll just say, just on the flip side, even if your politics are, less imaginative and you just sort of want to kind of nibble at the edges of the regulatory state, there is no way that you are going to be able to implement even some decent Wall Street reform without the kind of unparalleled grassroots army that Bernie's creating, which is a completely different thing that needs to be emphasized constantly. And of course, that's before we even get to foreign policy. You've just watched a Michael Brooks show video, and you can watch all of our full main live shows every Tuesday night at around 7 p.m. Eastern Time, and subscribe to get all of the clips you want. We're covering the globe. We're focusing on international relations, the intellectual dark web. We're having fun. We're doing deep dives with a lot of amazing guests. Of course, become a patron for the whole thing at patreon.com/TMBS, or subscribe to this YouTube channel and help us keep growing and get that content out there. Subscribe below.